Hey, so I'm planning my satire unit right now, which has Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Poe, spooky American lit stuff, and I wanted to just bring you along with me as I think through it. So I've been using the Nightmare Before Christmas as my planning anchor, which I know sounds weird, but stick with me because it's actually working out really well. So here's what we're doing. I have four big pieces I'm working through. The first one is this But Is It Funny framework that's been working really well as I'm thinking through it. And then we're going to look at outsider archetypes. So thinking about Jack, Ichabod, all these guys who don't fit. And then I'm thinking community rituals and how they keep us stuck. And then we'll connect it all to American Gothic tradition. So each section, I'll show you what I'm actually planning to do with students, and we'll talk a little bit about burnout as it comes up. So, all right, let's start with section one. So grab your coffee or whatever, and let's figure out how to teach satire. All right, so the first thing I need my students to understand is that satire doesn't always feel funny, right? It's part of humor, but it is a different kind of comedy than like slapstick, right? And I've been thinking about this Jordan Peele interview, where he talks about how horror is one of the few ways we can really address real life horrors in an entertaining way. Like Get Out is funny and terrifying, right? And that overlap is doing the work of social critique. And he has this moment in the interview where he talks about, I think this is really funny, how he says the difference between horror and comedy is the music. And if you just think about a scene that is pretty horrific, um, and then you change the music, you can make it comedic. Actually, I think it was an interview with Trevor Noah that we are connecting to here. So that's what I want students to see, that comedy and horror aren't opposites and that they share a lot of mechanics. And satire borrows from both. So that's what I was thinking when I decided that I wanted to go into Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I was thinking about what text is important for American literature. And I think understanding Irving and understanding some of our early literature is important for students to wrap their brains around. And I have a lot of memories about like the Hudson area and like as a child and thinking about Sleepy Hollow and this time of year in the fall in October, I think is really going to be fun. So the thing is, I do also want it to be pretty strong in our teaching, right? Like skills and standards. So I thought about how we could make the Legend of Sleepy Hollow something that is not just telling the story. I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting and also more real for students. And I started thinking more and more about satire. And when I was thinking about, um, I don't know, I guess they all converged or they both converged at the same time. I wanted to build around The Nightmare Before Christmas as my kind of planning anchor. I really like using films as anchors because it helps keep everything cohesive. And I'll explain this a little bit more. I'm not saying that I want my students to watch the film that I plan around. In this case, it actually works, but it's really more to keep everything cohesive and to keep my brain constrained a little bit. So I knew that I wanted to use Nightmare Before Christmas, and I kept coming back to The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. As I was I've been thinking a lot about early American lit, and I learned a lot about Irving and Poe and Hawthorne, and I just decided that I wanted to make an early American literature unit. So I started just like looking into them, and I have a lot of things to say, which we'll get into later. But Legend of Sleepy Hollow is something I just kind of kept coming back to because we can think about like, is Ichabod funny or tragic? Because when you look back at the story, you're like, it's not really that funny, you know? And you think about the way that the townspeople are treating him, and it's not funny. It's really not. And you also think about the headless horseman, and in our popular culture, it's pretty scary, but the way that it comes across, is it that scary, or is it ridiculous? It's a little ridiculous. So Irving's playing in that space where you're not quite sure what you're supposed to feel. And I think that's the satire, right? So that's what I want students to dig into. I've given myself the constraint of a 2-week unit, and I think Sleepy Hollow is a really good length for 2 weeks. The way that I plan is I will give myself a hard deadline. And if anything happens in between that, like if we have a snow day, if there's a fire drill and I have to change things, I'm not going to push the unit back. I'm going to just take something out. So, like later in the unit, I'll take a look at what I think is like I need to have that happen. But I think this is short enough that we can read it together, which is important sometimes. And we can really dig into the tone, but it's pretty substantial. So we can look at that satire deeply. Like we have enough time, substantial time. So we can also look at that before we branch out to Poe and Hawthorne, which is where I'm going next. And honestly, I think teaching satire through Gothic American Lit just really makes sense in October. So you got the spooky vibes, they're already there. So this is a unit that I'm planning primarily for you. And I'll talk about the way that I plan to look at it in my classroom, but I'll give everything, like I'll share all the thoughts that I have, so that you can take it and run with it too. So, okay, let me go back a little bit more as to why Nightmare Before Christmas is something that I wanted to look at. And you got Jack discovering Christmas, right? And he's like, what's this? It's delightful, right? He's so excited and curious, but is it funny? Or is it something else? And then you've got Lock, Shock, and Barrel. You've got that slapstick stuff. That's obviously comedy. But then Jack's obsession with understanding Christmas gets darker, right? And is that still funny? So, or is Burton mocking something? And that's what I want students to notice, that comedy exists on those different levels. And satire lives near the top when you're mocking ideas and not just doing physical gags. And I think that they understand this when they are consuming, but giving some language to what that means, I think is going to be really powerful for them. Years ago, and I tried to find it in preparation for this, there was this read, write, think activity on, the NCTE read, write, think. And it was about using the comedy ladder to identify comedy types. And I've been thinking about using this idea of a comedy ladder. And so I've also been experimenting and thinking about how we need to give our students thinking frames, right? So when we say they're not ready for this, like we don't think that they could do this cognitively, it's because they don't have the scaffolding for it. They haven't gotten the right schema in order to do this. So we can wait for them to build it on their own, or we can intentionally do that. And one of the things that I've been experimenting with and really enjoying is thinking about what I want them to build on a continuum, like a ladder. And I look at that more and give you I talk all about how we can use the idea of thermometers and ladders in our planning for all kinds of things like writing, and also degrees of, like, to what extent is this a strong symbol, so thinking about how we can really identify this as a framework for students, like how do you actually use these continuums, and also how do you make this kind of nebulous idea of one end of the spectrum to the other, and make it something that's more tangible for students. And I go into this more on Substack, but that was a little bit of, and I'll put a link, but that was a little bit of a detour to say that the comedy ladder that I saw on NCTE really inspired this. And what that ladder did, like I said, I tried to find it and couldn't. Maybe someone can find that and then maybe put it in the comments. But it takes like slapstick, low comedy, and all the way up to like high comedy, comedy of manners. And that when you place satire like towards the top there, it helps students to understand that we're dealing with something different than what they might normally think of as comedy. Okay, so like, at the low level, you have physical comedy, slapstick. Um, Anyone can laugh. Not everybody does, because some people see this as low humor that they don't really find funny. Then you have like social comedy that would be like, Friends. Seinfeld really is more social comedy, talking about status and how people act. And then you have that higher level, like satire and mocking ideas and beliefs and systems. And what I think students can look at is identifying what is being mocked, not just what's funny, but who or what is the joke on. So that's one really important aspect to this. So with my students, what I'm going to be doing is building a soundtrack activity and also looking at this like comedy ladder and thinking about what's funny about it. And we'll do that with our, I'm going to bring in some sample text, and then we'll get into Sleepy Hollow, where we'll really look at like, is Ichabod funny? Is the headless horseman scary? And what is Irving actually mocking here? Okay, so that was all pretty high level, but here's my actual plan. So I'll introduce that framework in the Comedic Ladder. I think what I'll do here is use the Nightmare Before Christmas clips. So I can use that as a hook. And then we'll read Legend of Sleepy Hollow together and talk about it. And then soundtrack activity, where they're going to pair passages with different music to see how tone shifts. And that's going to be the major hit points of my unit. I also want to get into Mickey Mouse. Like Mickey Mouse. Of course, this is Mickey Mouse, right? Mickey Mouse and how what people have done with Steamboat Willie now that it is in the public domain. And I think that will be what I use before I go into the rest of my American Literature unit, the early American Literature unit. So, okay, look, I know what students actually want here. I think what they want is to understand, if we're thinking, what are the different levels that we need to consider before we really get into planning the unit. I think first, what we want to look at is how students can understand why old literature feels confusing or boring. Because I don't think it's just that it's old. I mean, if you look on the surface about what the story is about, it feels pretty compelling, I think. So I don't think it's the story itself. It is a little bit of the language, but it's also the way that it's presented. So I want us to actually look at that. So why do they find it confusing or boring? Because I don't want them to just dismiss something because it's old. And I want to give them tools to decode tone. That was hard to say altogether. And think about when it's not obvious. So we'll use that spectrum thinking and get into that. And I want them to feel smart about noticing things. So that's one of the goals of my unit. And I think that this will be helpful because we're looking at a short text, and then we can use it to get into our longer, challenging text and hopefully give them some quick wins, but give them a lot of tools to make confusing text make sense. And I think using satire will hopefully be a helpful tool for them to think about, like humor and horror, things that I think are fun to think about here now in October. And, I keep thinking about, as I'm using Nightmare Before Christmas as a frame, that like the way that we can look at Jack ourselves. So Jack sees Christmas and immediately thinks, this is what's been missing. This will solve all my boredom with Halloween. And it's a little bit of what we're doing with students. Like we're trying to find the tools to help them to feel like this isn't like old and boring. But I think that's also something for us to think about as teachers, because we have to resist this idea that there's something wrong and there's something missing, and that there's something out there that's going to be your magical bullet for your like fixing your classroom. Like if I have that one perfect teaching strategy, if I see something shiny, like maybe it's like how I can do discussions, or it's something I can put on my wall, or some kind of tool, and then this will fix my engagement problems. I think that's something that we really need to look out for, and not chase novelty. So I think looking back at this framework, it's not something that's new. I'm taking something that is grounded in what I pulled out many, many years ago. And I think that that's something that I've found myself doing more and more this year and last year too. Just as things speed up, I think we need to find ways to slow down. So using something that is intentional, that is really helping students, like we keep that in mind. Like, is this helping students? Is this helping them to become stronger thinkers? And that's what I really think matters here. Okay, so planning decisions. I need to decide how we're actually going to experience The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And I think I have three options. So the first option is read it aloud as a class. So in this case, I can control pacing. We can stop for discussions, but it could take forever. It's a pretty short text, but I think it could still, like, we have the danger of it taking longer as some students zone out as we stop for conversations. I could, of course, assign it for homework and not be sure that everyone has read it. I could do a combination of things to help to encourage students to read that may not do it on their own. So we could do a combination of at home and in class. That is an option. I also have option 2 is the audio version. And I took a look at what is available. There are both a good abridged version that has some great visuals that students can watch, and it can keep them engaged. There is another version that doesn't have images on it, but it does have a nice professional narration, and that can help us get a little bit faster. And I do find, like, depending on the class, sometimes I can speed that up a little bit too, so that we get through it a little bit fast, like even faster. So that's an option, the audio version. I could also use the audio version if I use YouTube in combination with like quizzes, and then I can ask them questions and also track if students have read. So that's an option as well. And then the third option is, instead of reading, we could look at Disney's 1949 animated version. So if we did that, it is short. It's like 30 minutes. It is very visual. It does show a tone, but it is not the actual text. So that is something that we would have to just decide that we are going to do something different. So with all those things under consideration, what I am going to do is go with the audio and have students read along in the text. I think this is the best of both worlds. So they get that professional narration that helps with the tone and the language, but they can also follow along and see Irving's actual words. I think I'm also going to keep the option. I'll take a look at it so that I'm going to have to look at the timing, but I'm going to keep open the option of also giving some audio for homework and using quizzes and asking questions. That way I can know who actually did it because I can track that in quizzes. And that would be, I can also, if I do that, I can also track comprehension, which makes me think maybe one of the things that I want to do as we're reading is maybe make a like a pear deck and do the same thing in class, like have students answer questions as we're reading. And that would mean that I can maybe speed up a little bit the comprehension aspect of it, like making sure that students actually understand what's happening. And in that case, I can also like help them with vocabulary and things like that. I think that I'll probably do that as well. And that also gives us an opportunity to still pause for discussion whenever we need to. And I think that by having the audio and maybe doing a little bit of audio for homework, we could have time to actually use the Disney version as an analysis tool, which I'm pretty excited about. I think that'll be really good. So here's what I'm thinking. After we read Sleepy Hollow and we've done that initial analysis, I'll show that 1949 Disney animated version. Like I said, it's only 30 minutes. And then what we can do is analyze what Disney chose to emphasize. And we can look at that against what we thought about Irving's version and think about what was made now funnier and what was made scarier and what they did to change Irving's tone. And I think that reveals what Disney thought the story was, and we can compare that to what we think Irving was doing. And okay, so I mentioned Steamboat Willie, right? So this is what I started thinking about when I was considering using the that audio, or sorry, using the Disney Sleepy Hollow. Have you looked at, so the same time I think that The Great Gatsby came into the public domain, Steamboat Willie came into the public domain. I could be making that up as far as timing, but it's been very, very recent. And what has been happening is that people started making horror versions of Steamboat Willie, Mickey. So like Mickey Mouse horror games, like creepy fan films, all that stuff. It's weird, right? That's wild to me. So of all the things that you could do with that likeness, you could have like wholesome nostalgia, modern reimaginings, whatever. People chose horror. Why? I mean, I think that's a question, right? Like, what is it about taking something innocent and making it scary that appeals to us? It's pretty crazy to me. And I think though, that connects directly back to Irving and Burton, right? But like what that is core to what Burton does with his films. We got Frankenweenie, we got Edward Scissorhands, we got Nightmare Before Christmas. Obviously, they're playing with that overlap, and it shows that it's almost like we have these two ends of the spectrum, but then they kind of like come together, and that's the way that they connect again. And so they're playing with that overlap, taking something that could be cozy, like we have small town stories, holiday traditions, and then injecting a little bit of horror into it, or taking horror and making it funny. So I think students are going to get this part with Mickey because, well, maybe they've seen the Mickey horror stuff, but they've definitely seen some of the Burton horror. So I think that we can make a connection to that. And they know that overlap feels interesting and a little transgressive in a way that straight horror or straight comedy doesn't do. So the Disney lesson becomes watch the 1949 version, analyze Disney's tone versus Irving's, discuss Steamboat Willie phenomenon, like why horror, and then connect to what satire does, like takes familiar things and twist them to expose something. And this gives them also this modern cultural touch point that'll make it feel relevant. So what am I actually teaching here? I talked about it a little bit at the opening, but I want them to walk away with identifying tone, analyzing what's being satirized. Um, that's not just it's satire, but the target, right? And then I want them to recognize and play around with that comedy horror overlap and how it creates meaning, and be able to then transfer this lens to other American Gothic texts. So we'll be getting into Poe and Hawthorne after this. And I also want to help them ask better questions about author's purpose and audience. So these are also transferable skills that we'll use throughout. And for me, I want them to stop treating a literature like it's boring. So that's something that I really want to work on during this unit, helping them to see what Irving was doing and that he was being funny and weird and kind of playing with his audience, and helping them see that. And I want them to have those quick wins. I want them to feel smart when they notice something. But also, I want a unit that doesn't drain me. And that's partly why I wanted to bring in the Steamboat Willie and also the Disney, because I guess I didn't really watch Steamboat Willie. I mean, both of these are before my time, but I do remember watching in elementary school, maybe, that version of Sleepy Hollow. So when you look at it against what Hawthorne was trying to do, it makes this like really interesting, um, like, why is it that we look at this in elementary school kind of thing? Why did Disney do this? And Disney, of course, was a different kind of company before, but I think that's something for us to look at. But I'm actually excited about this unit, and I think that using Nightmare Before Christmas as my personal anchor really helps, because it keeps me engaged in the planning. I can keep going back to the movie and thinking about, okay, how can I add a little bit more complexity? How can I add a different lens while still staying in a lane, while still having it be contained? So that means that I'll be more engaged when I'm teaching it. Okay, so that's the foundation. And then next, what we'll talk about is the next section, which will be more about performance. And we'll really get into lessons and what those will look like in the next video.